Um, this is the first of our Lunch and Learn sessions of the year. I also want to let everybody know that we are recording this session, so it will be available after today for anybody who was not able to join us, or if you want to go back and review it, you're certainly welcome to do that. Renee, would you, we'll be doing 4 of these sessions over the course of the year. We're doing it the first Thursday of every quarter, every calendar quarter. And Renee has the name and title of the next presentation and the date.
I do, yes. So our next one, in case you want to put it on your calendar, is on April 6th. So it's always usually a first Tuesday of the month, and quarterly.
Thursday.
Right? Or Thursday.
First Thursday.
Thank you. And at noon still, Central Time. And the speaker is Major Walter McCall. And I'm trying to remember, he's going to be talking about military chaplaincy, I believe.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And we'll have more information about that soon. I'll email you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn the session over to Tamara and Michele and let you introduce yourselves and tell us where all this material came from, and then walk us through it. So we're in your hands.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Thompson. I am currently, I guess, unemployed until the 17th. I've just been hired as the staff chaplain at Memorial Hermann, Greater Heights in Houston. So I've been around chaplaincy for about 9 years, starting out with Lifeline chaplaincy and as a volunteer chaplain there, and went through training, went through seminary. That's where I met Michele at the Seminary for the Southwest in Austin. And Michele and I, although we share the same last name, are not related, but we are sisters in Christ. We always tell people. And this presentation today is as the result of a class project that we did together in a seminary class on crisis in ministry. So I'm going to turn it over to Michele, and we'll talk more about the project a little bit later.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you're joining us. My name is Michele Thompson. I live in Austin, and I'm a staff chaplain with Ascension Seton Medical Center. For about the last year, I have been in one of the perinatal chaplains. So I'm not an expert in this field. And but what we're going to present to you is the voices of some people that we surveyed. I am also affiliated with Lifeline Chaplaincy, have been a volunteer with them for probably 9 or 10 years also, and haven't been doing patient visits lately, but help with the training for the new volunteer chaplains. So we're just grateful to be with you today. So after Tamara and I did this project in seminary, we really felt compelled. Thank you, Renee. We really felt, excuse me, we really felt compelled to present it to our Lifeline Chaplaincy volunteers. And so we had a workshop in Austin. We did one in Houston also. Those workshops were 3 hours long. So we have worked really hard to distill a 3-hour tour down to a 1-hour tour. So hopefully we will get through all the material. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, Renee. This is where you're going to have a chance to introduce yourself to us. So Renee is going to drop down a poll, and you are going to answer a question for us.
Should be up. So just
So-
let me know when you want me to end it. I'll look at the numbers here, see how many
Okay.
we've had answered.
This helps us know who our audience is, because our original audience that we presented this to were volunteers and ministry leaders. And a lot of the material is geared towards that. So it looks like we've got professional and volunteer chaplains. We have ministers, elders, or ministry leaders, and caring people also. So we are glad all of you are with us. And this will help us know a little bit better how to formulate our conversation, even though I do have to admit that it is mainly geared towards ministry leaders. So, okay. And then let's do one more poll. And this poll is related to our topic today. And if you'll answer those questions. So we can see even just in this small group that over 50% of you have experienced a pregnancy loss. Some of you felt supported by your faith community. Some of you did not. A few of you have experienced infertility also. And thankfully, looks like you felt supported by your faith community. So you can see right now, even within this small group, you are going to understand a lot of what we are going to talk about today. So let's launch into our PowerPoint. So these are our workshop objectives. We want to raise awareness of the significance of reproductive loss, and you've already seen that in our own little small poll. Based on our surveys responses, we're going to suggest ways to respond appropriately to those people. And our hope is that we will increase sensitivity of ministry leaders and provide examples of ways that you can acknowledge these losses within your faith community and in your worship practices. And our workshop goal is to provide care that would evoke this response. And I'll read this quote to you. It was very meaningful to be surrounded with so many friends and family members that have suffered through the same trials. They were able to listen and empathize without offering the words, "Everything happens for a reason, and God has a plan or his will." While God does have his will, it is not helpful nor biblical to suggest his will is to take such a precious gift from their parents so early. So having others know when to speak and what to say and what not to say is so helpful. And those are the things that we're going to talk about today. So the first section I want to go over with you is, I feel like first we need to very briefly go through some definitions of reproductive loss. And then I want us to consider the 3 dimensions of personal loss. Next slide. So reproductive loss may occur as a result of these situations. The first one is, our normal terminology is miscarriage. I prefer early pregnancy loss. And depending on the statistics, between 15 and 25% of pregnancies end during the first 12 weeks of the pregnancy. And 1 to 5% of pregnancies end between 13 and 20 weeks. So if you keep in mind that a normal pregnancy is 39 weeks, then 1 to 5 1 to 5% of pregnancies are lost up to halfway through that pregnancy. If you look at the outliers of those numbers, the 25% and the 5%, that really is stunning to me, because that means 30% of the women or the couples in your faith community, in any group, have experienced a pregnancy loss. And that seems like a lot to me. Another type of reproductive loss is an ectopic pregnancy. And that's where the fertilized embryo implants in the fallopian tube, and it's a non-sustainable pregnancy. This happens in about 2% of pregnancies and always requires surgical intervention. The next type of reproductive loss is called stillbirth, and that's a loss that occurs after 20 weeks. So that would be within the second half of the pregnancy, and that occurs in about 1 to 100 pregnancies, not as often. So it could occur at the 21st week of pregnancy. It could occur at the 39th week of pregnancy. The next type of loss is neonatal death. And that's when a death of an infant occurs within the first 28 days of life. A very small number, less than 1% of births. Another type of reproductive loss we're going to talk about today is infertility. This affects 1 in 8 couples. Even from our little small survey, I think it was 1 in 7 of us have been affected by infertility. And so it's something that is very real that we want to talk about. And then the last reproductive loss that I want to mention is abortion. And I know our laws have changed here recently, but it has occurred in the past. And there will be women within your faith community who have experienced an abortion for any of these reasons. But it is still a loss and needs to be recognized as that. So I'd like to talk about the 3 dimensions of personal loss. The first one is physical loss, the physical loss that occurs in a reproductive loss. First of all, the mother, and I may refer mainly to the mother, but the father also feels this way, will feel the failure of her body to function normally. This occurs in a pregnancy loss, in an early pregnancy loss or a stillbirth. And I would say this also occurs for couples who are experiencing infertility. And then another physical loss that occurs is, that's okay, Renee, you can leave that there. Another physical loss that occurs is most pregnancy losses, the mother actually will have to go through labor to deliver the baby. And so that's labor without an expected result. The second dimension of personal loss is emotional loss. I think this one is very understandable to everyone. The parents, the mother or the father may experience guilt or feel responsibility for the loss in the pregnancy. There may be some fear. Is it going to happen again? There's obviously emotional distress that occurs, especially if the woman or the couple are not receiving understanding and validation from other people who just don't understand. And as an emotional loss, there's the loss of a dream, the inability to make a future, and a hope deferred, sometimes temporarily, sometimes forever. The third dimension of personal loss is spiritual loss. And these are the questions that I hear at the hospital a lot. Why did God let this happen? Is God in control or not? It's one of those things we have to decide for ourselves. Where is my baby? Does my baby have a soul? Will I see my baby in heaven? And there may be some complicated feelings also regarding the loss if something occurred, or maybe in the case of an abortion, the mother may have some very complicated feelings about that. So what we want to be aware of is that we may unknowingly affect a person's faith when we try to explain their loss. And so we want to stay away from doing that. So I'm going to turn it over to Tamara, and she's going to talk to you about our survey and the survey results.
Thank you, Michele. One of the things we felt really strongly about, because we had limited experience with reproductive loss, that we really wanted to hear from women who had experienced it and couples who had experienced this. Okay, next slide, please. So we did a survey as our class project, as I told you in the beginning, and it occurred from October to November in 2018. We had a total of 61 responses. And I cannot emphasize enough that this was not a scientific survey. It was very informal. We distributed through Facebook, church lists, Lifeline Chaplaincy, and had people share it with others. And so we feel like we got a fairly good representation after looking through all of the answers. We feel that they are pretty representative of how people feel out there. And this was mainly about how you were dealing with it in your faith community. Next slide, please. One thing I do want to add is that when we presented this, we had a lot of people come up to us in class and talk about their reproductive loss. People that some of them said they had never shared it. We also had family and friends who came to us and talked about things that they had never shared before. So once we opened the door to this, we were flooded with experiences. I had a family member who had never talked about her infertility, talked to me candidly and in tears about it. Michele had a family member talk to her about a long-held secret. So, I mean, it's out there, and it's not talked about, and we wanted it to come out in the open and to see how people deal with it, especially in a faith community. Next slide, please. So we ask 7 questions of those dealing with miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, and 5 questions of those who were dealing with infertility. And the first question that we presented to those who had lost through miscarriage or stillbirth, infant death, was, what did you find most helpful in dealing with your loss? And if you can read those, I know it's pretty tiny, but we found that a majority, 55% of the people found that visits from a friend, or said visits from a friend, were helpful. Hugs and words of comfort were tied for next, and then offers to pray and meals were the third choice. Those were also tied. The least helpful, if you'll notice there, was phone calls. We were a little bit surprised about that, but one person said, well, actually, we're going to go on to the next slide. We asked, what did you find the least helpful in dealing with your loss? Well, as you can see from this particular slide, overwhelmingly, it was misguided words of comfort. As you can imagine, the comments that people make that are well-meaning, that come up, can be hurtful. And we all know that words matter, especially as we care for people going through sensitive losses. The second one is phone calls, and this surprised me a little bit. But reading through the comments, one person said, I felt like an information booth. People were calling. I had to give the same story all the time. And again, you would hear a lot of misguided words of comfort. So those two kind of go hand in hand. Also, we had a category of other, and some people said just avoiding the issue was least helpful for them, acting like it never happened. And just hearing that, oh, you can always have another baby. As we go on to question 3, what did you need? This is what the first 2 questions are, what they got, and what you need was the second 2 questions. So we asked what they really needed in relation to their loss. And you can see from here that visits from a friend, which kind of goes along with our first question, were really helpful. But the second one came in, privacy started showing up, that they wanted to be left alone. So that was, well, actually hugs came in second, but privacy also came in there. And so that was really telling to us that there is a privacy that they do want. But one person said, you know, it was kind of strange. I wanted to be left alone, but I also wanted to have people with me. And there's this ambivalence about what people need. They wanted to have church personnel give the people who have suffered pregnancy loss the option of how and whether it should be made public. I thought that was a very insightful comment. And one person said, just pure encouragement without trying to make me feel like you understood how I was feeling. So the next slide was question 4. What did your spouse need in relation to your loss? And this was also very telling for us. As you see, privacy came out on top, but what we heard from several people is they really didn't know. They didn't know what their spouse needed. And we found out that there is a real breakdown in people communicating about grief when it's this sensitive. And there's a real pressure for the spouse to be helpful to the woman, and they don't get to really share what they're going through a lot of times. And sometimes they're just not acknowledged at all. All the attention is showered onto the woman. So if there is attention. So this was a real telling question for us. Meals and housework came in as something that was important to people, because if that's taken care of, that the couple could comfort each other and on their own. And also childcare was something that was mentioned that was really helpful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, question 5 was kind of a 2-part. We asked them to rank these several things, and let me see if I can read them to you. I know that it's very small there. Let me see if I can. The first one is a support group of women. The second one is a support group for the men or for the spouses. Third is a memorial service to remember the loss. The next one is a naming service or a blessing. Private counseling, which is the one that came in the top, considered the most important, was the next one. A prayer chain where someone calls someone and then they call another person. That was the next one. A prayer service for the loss, meals, then hospital visits, and then privacy. And so we were kind of interested in all of these different practices and how they ranked them. As you can see, that they really like support groups. They thought that that was a real helpful thing to provide for them. And private counseling was really helpful, or they considered it really helpful. Okay, next slide, please. Then we asked them to suggest other practices their church could provide that would be helpful. And so here's some of they came sort of in categories. A lot of people said acknowledgement of the loss. they said, just own the death just like you would any other death of a church family member. Or don't assume the grief is over when a new birth comes. Feel okay to acknowledge their loss and call them by name. This is from some people who had secondary, well, they had a child after they had lost a miscarriage, and they really still remembered the child that they had lost. And they wanted people to remember that person as well. Okay, the next one was just an understanding that each situation and each person has unique needs. And I think as chaplains and people who care for others, that this is very important, that this is something that we keep in mind all the time. One person said a balance of support and privacy is very important. I don't think that there is a standard menu that would work for everyone. I think a church community needs to be open to the discussion and reach out, but the treatment is so very personal. And then the next thing that kept showing up, of course, was household chores, meals, and childcare, that this is very important at a time when a couple is grieving and they have other children at home. One woman said that she couldn't bear to wear the clothes that she wore to the hospital, and so a friend brought her different clothes so that she could go home. Another one had a friend go to her house before she came home after a infant loss, and just cleaned out the nursery so that she wouldn't have to face that. Okay, next one, please. Memorials were another helpful suggestion. And one person said that it could be, once a year. It doesn't have to be at the time of the loss. One said that each Easter their church recognized members who had died, and that they thought that they could also include reproductive losses from reproduction in this as well. And the next thing, we had several people mention supports, class, counseling, prayer, cards, and support for the spouse. Finally, the next question. Please tell us about your most meaningful encounter in your faith community following your loss. And this was very telling for us. Next slide, please. The first thing that came up in all of these questions was that there was no support from the church, from their faith community. Several people said this, and this was really sad to me. Several people said that they lost their faith due to how they were treated after losing a child. One person said, my church was large and didn't offer individual support. It was more focused on teaching the word than getting involved in people's personal traits and tribulations. And then one person said, there was nothing. I was expected to go on. So this becomes a faith issue for our faith communities. If people are losing their faith over how they're treated after pregnancy loss, it's very telling. My dog is sitting behind me if you hear some grunts. And let's see, visits from friends and support from those who had been there or worse. They also considered a meaningful encounter. Heard this from a couple different people. And then again, also mentioned were the meals, memorials, allowing me to cry and weeping with me, just being there and not telling them to stop crying or something like that. Allowing them to show their emotions, I think, is very important. And then this, the next slide, I really liked this quote, so I wanted to share it with you. My closest friend, after months of grief, told me that I can take this grief and let it destroy me, or I can choose to make it into a victory for God. I will never forget her bravery, or honesty. I chose to move forward and help others who had experienced loss. Every loss is individual. There is a common thread. If a person has the gift of perception and perspective awareness, they are the ones to seek out to be there for the grief-stricken. Grief remains. I think this has a couple really solid points that a friend who felt like she could be honest with the woman who was grieving, reached out to her and basically gave her a choice of how she could approach her future. As chaplains, we can't really give advice, but I think this, if you have a close friend, I think this is a real honor to be able to do this, because she went on to choose to help others. But also the second to last sentence really struck me. If a person has the gift of perception and perspective awareness, they are the ones to seek out to be there for the grief-stricken. And I would venture to say that everyone on this seminar is a person who has the gift of perception and perspective awareness. That's why you're here. And so just remember that you might be sought out at a time like this, and that the grief will remain for a long time. We had one person say that they still are grieving after 32 years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we wanted to talk about those who are dealing with silent grief, which this is all silent grief, but infertility is very different from all of this. So next slide, please. We asked survey participants 5 questions. And let me get, yeah, okay. And the first question was how long? We wanted to know how long they had been dealing with infertility. And if you'll notice from our survey, 77% were dealing with it from 3 to 9 years. That's a long time to be trying to have a child and being disappointed, often monthly. I mean, it just really is heartbreaking to see how many people are dealing with this, and often dealing with it on their own. The second question we asked, next slide, please, was, have you shared your infertility with people in your faith community? I was really surprised about this, but overwhelmingly 83% said yes, they had shared. But we found, well, the next question, please. We asked them, tell us why you chose to share, or why you chose not to share your infertility issues with people in your faith community. And so what we got was basically 3 levels of sharing. The first one was that they did not share. They just didn't feel like it was anybody's business. One person said, it just never crossed my mind. I wanted to work with my doctor. Several people just chose not to share because it was too private. They just didn't want to. But the next level of sharing, which kind of comes in with, yes, they shared, is they shared on a limited basis. They shared with people who might be going through the same thing, or close friends, of course, family members. Some of them said they shared just because they people were asking questions, so they would share when people asked. And then the final level of sharing was that they just wanted to get it out in the open because too many people were asking, or they wanted prayer support, or they just, well, one person said that they were involved in a church-based infertility support group, which I thought was great. And so they got more comfortable about sharing their experience. So they felt the shame and the loneliness and the brokenness kind of left them in that. And so they were able to give that up in their support group and feel more free, or feel freer to share with people in their faith community, which I thought was great. And some people said that after they started to go through the adoption process, they started to share about their infertility process, mainly to just kind of stop questions as well. Okay, the next question, please. We ask, what churches might offer. And I think there's a list there. Yeah. We presented them with this list of possibilities, and they said, some of them chose a few, but most of them said all of these. We would love all of these. And again, the last one, nothing, I wanted to be left alone. We remember that there's this tension of wanting both and. So it's being sensitive, it's offering prayers, it's just being aware of what's involved in infertility. And the next question, I think this is the last question, is what do you wish your faith community might offer? And we thought that this question, I think there's a slide before this. Is there not? Well, anyway, okay, sorry. Okay, this quote we thought was also really, really telling. It says, a theology and a practice that values singleness and childlessness as highly as they value family, that recognize that a woman does not have to be a mother to be fulfilled and to be fulfilling God's role for her, that doesn't isolate the couple as a problem, but supports them by inviting them into the presence of all the family stuff. This was something that we heard, that people didn't want to be excluded from family stuff. They wanted to be around children. Most of them did, but they didn't want to kind of be treated as pariahs since they didn't have children. And then we ask, what was the hardest part for them? Is dealing with a couple. Dealing with infertility as a couple. And there were several answers. Inaccurate assumptions on the parts of others, feeling like they don't fit in because there's so much emphasis on family. Perceived lack of caring from others, mainly because people just don't understand what infertility means, and the pain of infertility. Next one, please. Inappropriate questions and comments, asking when you're going to have children, or saying, well, if you start the adoption process, you'll get pregnant right away. These are some of the comments that are just not helpful and inappropriate. Next one, special days like Mother's Day and Father's Day are particularly hard for some people if they're talking about children being blessings. And that puts the childless in a state of, well, if I don't have a child, does that mean I'm not blessed? Next one, please. Too much focus on family values, family emphasis in the church, that having a child is better than being childless. A perceived disregard for childlessness. Lack of understanding about the pain of infertility. This was mentioned earlier. And unanswered prayer. This was like they've been praying for a child for so long and they're just not getting pregnant. And that's a spiritual issue, a spiritual loss, a spiritual conundrum that we all need to consider, and how to deal with that with those who are going through infertility. And just to summarize all of this, these are the things that we would like for you to take away: that becoming more aware of infertility issues and how they affect a couple, providing empathy and compassion, organizing a support group, seeking to be inclusive of couples and singles without children, and tending to their spiritual needs. This is so important because people are losing their faith over how they're being treated. And this is an important thing. So we need to have that in mind. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Michele.
So as you can imagine, when there's a pregnancy loss, typically the women are going to gather around the woman who has experienced the loss. But through the survey and through some things that we had read also, there are other people that are grieving. And so we want to talk about overlooked grief. The first person we want to talk about is, of course, the dad. Dad may not know how to support his wife. He may, as Tamara mentioned, he may be trying to control his own emotions to allow her to show her emotions. And so dad is in a tough situation. Dad may feel forgotten, or as we saw, dad might also want to be left alone. But there's a possibility that dad gets left out of the care that needs to be given. And he may not even recognize that he's grieving. He may not recognize that the things that he may be going through, maybe depression or not wanting to go to work or not being engaged, could be manifestations of grief. So we definitely want to recognize dad's emotions. Next slide. And then here are some ways from what we read from the survey is that dad can be supported. First of all, is just be aware that this is a loss for dad too. And it needs to be acknowledged. We need to say to dad, I want you to know that I am thinking about you, and this, I know this has to be hard for you. We need to ask, what can we do to help, and volunteer to do those things. Tamara in one of her slides showed, help with meals, help with the yard work. But we don't want to push too, because dad may not want any help, but above all, listen to dad. Give him some space to talk. Next slide. If there are older children in the family, when the family has experienced a pregnancy loss, they may be confused. They may be grieving also. And so we need to remember to support them too. Obviously, we need to know what has been communicated to them by their parents and be sure that we honor that. If we have kids the same age, or even if we don't, offer to take the kids to do something to give mom and dad a chance to be at home by themselves. And also, I would suggest that when we are with the kids, to be sensitive to their demeanor or what's going on with them. They may feel like, if they're seeing mom crying, they don't want to cry. They don't want to make mom cry. And so we want to be supportive to them in that way. And next slide. I think probably grandparents are definitely forgotten in the grief that occurs when there's a pregnancy loss. It could be double sorrow for them. It probably is. Not only are they sad that they have lost a grandchild, but then for those of us who have kids, we feel so deeply when our kids are hurt, then they're feeling that pain for their children too. So it's double sorrow. It could bring up for them some past pregnancy losses that have not been acknowledged or recognized. There may be complicated grief. This point we added because we actually had someone who responded to our survey who said she was grieving the loss of a potential grandchild because her daughter had had an abortion, but she couldn't talk to anybody about it because she didn't want her daughter to be judged. So there was a great complication in that grief that she was feeling. So we need to be sure and ask the grandparents, how are you doing? Okay, next slide. So what is our response? What should our response be to people who have experienced a pregnancy loss or infertility? We need to be aware that grief is required for healing, but everyone's grief journey is different. And you can read that slide for yourself. Those of us who are volunteer chaplains or professional chaplains, we just know that people have an unexpected range of emotions, and we just have to honor that and be with them in it. And recognize that spiritual healing needs to occur. And that's fine. Thanks, Renee. Go on. And then here are just a few. We had a whole lot more than this, but these are a few of what not to say. I would tell somebody, if you're starting any sentence with "at least" or "be glad that," you just need to shut your mouth, because what you're going to say afterwards is not going to be helpful. And then here, the rest of these were some things that some of our survey participants told us that people said. And so these things are very hurtful and should not be said. Next slide. Here I would propose are some compassionate alternatives. And another saying I think we should stay away from is, "I know exactly how you feel," because even if we've both gone through a similar pregnancy loss, you and I are going to be feeling things very differently. So instead, if you've experienced a pregnancy loss, you could say, I've experienced this also. And if you want somebody to talk to, I'm available. And also the other thing people say is, "Call me if you need anything." Well, they're not going to call, and they may not know what they need. So it's up to us to be specific and ask if there are certain ways that we can help, and then set a time or a date. And I'll let you read the rest of those. But once again, the most important thing is that we show up and we listen. Next slide, please, ma'am. And remember, as was mentioned in the survey, we want to remember the baby that's been lost. That's one way that we can honor the family. Attending the memorial service, if one occurs, say the baby's name. They would love more than anything to hear someone else say their baby's name. Remember them on significant days, check in on holidays. You could plant a tree in the child's name, or make a donation to an organization that might be a good support organization. Next slide. So what I want to do in this last section is give you some suggestions for what you can do as a faith community. And these are things that some of us do even as perinatal chaplains, but they're things that can be done within the faith community in order to support the family. Okay, so go to the next two bullet points. Unless you work in a hospital as a chaplain, you probably don't know this. So if there's a pregnancy loss at 20 weeks or more, or if the baby that is born weighs 350 grams, which is about 12 ounces, the state of Texas requires burial and cremation through a funeral home. And even the family can choose a private burial if they want to, if the pregnancy was less than 20 weeks or less than 350 grams. This is the last thing that any couple is thinking about when they go into the hospital and when they're expecting a pregnancy loss. And so at my hospital, the perinatal social worker is the one who has this conversation with them. But if you go to the next point, please, Renee. Very, very often, the family does not want to see a chaplain. But if they are part of a faith community, this is where the minister, the elders, the ministry leaders, someone who is from the faith community should be willing to step up and go see that family while they're in the hospital and offer to help them in their funeral home selection. The social worker can help them with it, but there's just something about having someone who knows you and loves you be there and help you in that decision making. And what you would need to do also is know in advance in your area which funeral homes provide burial or cremation at a low cost for pregnancy losses, because there are funeral homes here in Austin that do that. I'm sure they do in Houston and other towns, but you need to have that information in advance. The social worker is going to have that information, will provide it, but I just think as a ministry leader, it's something that you also need to be aware of. Next slide, please. Okay, go ahead. One thing that I do in the hospital is at the time of a pregnancy loss, I'll ask the parents if they'd like to have a naming and blessing ceremony. And this is just a way to very formally say, God created this baby. God knows this baby. This is the baby's name. The baby is loved by God and by us. And then another thing that I do too is I actually make a certificate with the baby parent's name, the baby's name, and the date of birth. And this is so important. It's such a small little gesture, but it's so important because I had one mom just weep whenever when I gave her the certificate, because she said, I came into the hospital thinking I would carry my baby out, and this is the only thing I'm walking out with. And so it just really meant a whole lot to her. I want to look at Dwayne's message there. As a former labor and delivery chaplain who still thinks about your baby in heaven, you're thankful for that information. Thank you for sharing that, Dwayne. And then this is what was mentioned from some of the survey participants, is that they wish their church did a formal program. And so you could do an annual program. This is service of comfort. It could be a separate service or incorporated in your worship service. There could be a liturgy that's provided as a way to allow people to silently recognize their loss or openly recognize it. Tamara and I went to a support group called Made Known, and they did a balloon release as part of their ceremony. And the parents could take a balloon for each of their pregnancy losses. And they all released them outside. And Tamara and I were struck by how many couples released multiple balloons, had multiple pregnancy losses. But planning should include people who have experienced this loss. So if you're going to do something like this, be sure and include people who have experienced the loss. Okay, next slide. And then plan Mother's Day and Father's Day services with sensitivity. Tamara and I have a very nice liturgy for Mother's Day and Father's Day both, that includes people who wished they were parents or who are not parents for that service. So we'll be glad to share that with you if you'd like to have it. All right, next slide. Can you tell I'm trying to go fast? And if you decide that you want to form a ministry team, I'm just going to hop to the last one and say, shameless plug for Lifeline Chaplaincy. We have a wonderful training workshop called Ministry in Times of Illness and Loss. It's not related directly to pregnancy loss, but all types of loss, and would love for people in your church to participate in that training with us. Okay, next slide. All right, Tamara.
Well, I know we're out of time. We just have some resources. If you want them, you can email us. And I think the last slide shows those are book resources. There are many books that you can read on this topic. And I would suggest, if you just want to be more knowledgeable, that you would please just check out a book and start reading, because it is eye-opening what people go through. And the last slide is our email addresses. If you have questions, comments, we would hope to have enough time to take your questions and comments, but we do appreciate those in the chat. Thank you, Dwayne, for feeling free to share. And if I'm sure that you are all in communities that have resources, but if you would like some, there are email addresses and we can provide, or if you just wanted to send us an email with questions or whatever, there they are. So thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate your time today. We want to honor our hour with you if you need to say goodbye. We will stay on if you need to talk.